My billionaire partner thought he was publicly destroying my life to hide his organized scheme, but he didn't realize I had already alerted the Internal Security Service. He expected a celebration, but I was making sure he faced a huge term for the illegal weapons and prohibited substances hidden in our empire. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Pierre Ballroom hummed with a low electric energy that mirrored the tension in my chest. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of 5 years of shared ambition, late-night strategy sessions, and what I thought was unwavering loyalty. It was the anniversary of Vanguard Dynamics, the empire Julian and I had built from a dusty garage into a multi-billion-dollar tech powerhouse. I was wearing a deep emerald dress that cost more than my first car, standing by Julian's side as the flashes of 100 cameras blinded us. To the world, we were the ultimate power couple. To me, we were finally home. Julian squeezed my hand, but his grip wasn't warm. It was tactical, like a predator making sure its prey didn't bolt before the final strike. He stepped toward the mahogany podium, the crowd of investors, socialites, and hungry journalists falling into a practiced silence. I stood just a half step behind him, a smile frozen on my face, waiting for the moment he would announce our upcoming merger, and, as he'd promised over breakfast, our engagement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, "tonight is about growth. It's about shedding the old to make room for the new. Vanguard has reached a turning point, and to lead us into this next chapter, I've had to make some difficult decisions regarding the company's leadership and my own personal future." A murmur rippled through the room. I felt a slight chill. That wasn't the speech we'd rehearsed. Julian turned slightly, his eyes meeting mine. There was no love in them, only a cold, clinical detachment. "For too long," he continued, his voice rising, "I've allowed sentimentality to cloud my judgment. Elena has been a dedicated partner during our startup phase, but as we transition into global defense contracts and high-level infrastructure, it's become clear that her background and limitations are no longer an asset to this firm. In fact, they've become a liability." The room went deathly silent. I could hear the rhythmic clicking of a single camera in the back. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. "As of tonight," Julian announced, his gaze now fixed on the front row where a young woman in a shimmering silver dress, Sienna, the daughter of our biggest rival, sat smiling. "Elena is officially relieved of all duties at Vanguard Dynamics. Our personal relationship has also reached its natural conclusion. I wish her the best, of course, but Vanguard needs a vision that she simply cannot provide. Sienna and I will be heading the new board together." Gasps erupted. People I had known for years suddenly looked at me with pity, or worse, with the predatory hunger of those sensing a fall from grace. Julian didn't even look back at me. He gestured for Sienna to join him on stage. The betrayal was so surgical, so publicly brutal, that it was meant to shatter me. He wanted me to break down, to cry, to be escorted out by security so he could claim I was unstable. He thought he had stripped me of everything, my job, my reputation, my home. He thought he had spent the last 6 months quietly transferring my shares and sidelining my influence without me noticing. He believed he was the architect of my ruin. What Julian didn't know was that I had been watching him long before he started watching the door. I knew about the organized scheme he'd been running behind the scenes to inflate our quarterly earnings. I knew about the prohibited substances that were being moved through our logistics chain under the guise of medical supplies. I even knew about his secret meetings with radicals who were interested in our encrypted communication tech for all the wrong reasons. As Julian leaned in to kiss Sienna, the applause starting to swell from the sycophants in the front row, I took a slow, deliberate step toward the second microphone on the podium. The security guard moved to intercept me, but I gave him a look that froze him in his tracks. It was the look of a woman who had already burnt the bridge Julian was standing on. I leaned into the mic, my voice calm, steady, and amplified across the entire ballroom. "Julian," I said, the name cutting through the noise like a blade. "I figured you'd try to take the easy way out, but before you introduce your new partner, perhaps you should explain to the internal security service why your private server just went live on the ballroom's main screen." Julian spun around, his face draining of color as the massive 40-foot LED display behind him flickered from the Vanguard logo to a scrolling list of encrypted offshore accounts and high-resolution photos of crates filled with illegal weapons, stamped with his personal seal. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Julian's mouth hung open, his organized scheme laid bare for every billionaire and federal agent in the room to see. But the real blow was yet to come. I leaned in closer to his ear, the microphone still picking up my whisper. "That's just the appetizer, Julian. I've spent the last year making sure that if you ever left me, you'd be leaving for a cage." Just then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall burst open, and a dozen men in dark suits with internal security badges flooded the room. Julian looked at the screen, then at the agents, then at me. His hand trembled as he reached for the podium to steady himself. You wouldn't," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. "You're in this too, Elena. If I go down, you go down." I leaned back, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. "Check the signatures on those documents again, Julian. I wasn't your partner this year. I was your auditor." But as the agents closed in, Julian's terror suddenly shifted. A dark, twisted grin replaced his look of shock. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small, sleek remote. "Then I guess it's a good thing I prepared for a grave accusation tonight, too," he whispered. "If I'm not leaving this room a king, Elena, no one is leaving it at all." He pressed the button, and the lights in the entire building went pitch black. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight, thick with the smell of expensive perfume turned sour by the sudden, sharp scent of panic. Screams ripped through the ballroom, the sound of chairs overturning and glassware shattering, echoing like distant gunfire. Julian's laugh, distorted by the dying capacitors of the sound system, crackled one last time through the speakers before cutting out entirely. I didn't move. I had spent 6 months preparing for the moment Julian would try to break me, and I knew his ego wouldn't let him just walk away. He needed a spectacle. He needed to be the one who ended everything on his terms. My hand went to the small, cold dial of the watch on my left wrist. I turned the bezel 3 clicks to the right. A soft amber glow blossomed in my peripheral vision. Thermal optics embedded in my contact lenses, a prototype from Vanguard's own unauthorized research wing that Julian didn't even know existed. The room transformed into a world of heat signatures. The panicked crowd looked like shifting orange ghosts, and the internal security agents were structured silhouettes of deep red, moving with tactical precision toward the stage. Julian was a bright, frantic streak of white heat, moving toward the service exit behind the heavy velvet curtains. He wasn't alone. Sienna was with him, her movements too calm, too coordinated for a socialite caught in a blackout. She wasn't clutching his arm in fear. She was leading him. "You really thought it was that simple, Julian?" I whispered into the dark, knowing my lapel mic was still recording to a remote server. I maneuvered through the chaos with the grace of someone who had mapped this room 1,000 times. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the server cabinet hidden behind the podium. Julian had tried to lock the building down, likely hoping to use the hazardous situation to scrub the data I'd just broadcast. He wanted to frame the entire evening as a security breach by an unstable ex-employee. As I reached the cabinet, I saw 2 of Julian's radicals, men he had brought in under the guise of private event security, moving to intercept the internal security team. They weren't just guards. They were professionals, part of his organized scheme, tasked with ensuring no one left the ballroom until Julian's trail was cold. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not fear. I reached into the hidden compartment of the podium and pulled out a small encrypted tablet. With a few swipes, I overrode Julian's lockdown. But I didn't turn the lights back on. Not yet. I needed him to think he was winning for just a few more minutes. I followed the heat signatures of Julian and Sienna into the narrow corridor behind the stage. The air here was cooler, smelling of floor wax and old stone. Julian was shouting now, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "The transport is supposed to be at the loading dock. Where are they?" "Patience, Julian," Sienna's voice replied. It was different now, hard, cold, and stripped of its debutante sweetness. "The group is moving into position. We just need to clear the perimeter." I stepped out from the shadows, my silhouette framed by the faint emergency exit light at the far end of the hall. "The transport isn't coming, Julian." Julian spun around, his face a mask of sweating, pale terror in the dim light. He fumbled with his remote, but I had already fried the receiver. "Elena, how did you—" He looked at Sienna, then back at me. "You're dead. You're professionally and legally dead. I've tied every prohibited substance shipment to your digital signature. I've made sure the organized scheme has your face on it." "I know," I said, stepping closer. "That's why I didn't just audit the accounts. I audited your partners." I looked directly at Sienna. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at me, and for the first time, she smiled. A genuine, predatory smile. She reached into her silver clutch and pulled out not a phone, but a heavy, black device. "She's right, Julian," Sienna said softly. "The transport isn't coming for you." Julian's eyes widened as the realization hit him. He backed away, his hands raised. "Sienna, what are you doing? We had a deal. I gave you the access codes to the defense infrastructure." "And I thank you for that," Sienna replied. "But the internal security in the ballroom, they don't work for the government, and they don't work for you." She turned the device toward me, but she didn't point it at me. She pressed a button, and a low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards. My thermal vision flickered and died. "Elena," Sienna said, her voice now amplified by the narrow hallway. "You were so focused on Julian's little organized scheme that you didn't see the much larger one. Julian was just the distraction I needed to get to you." Suddenly, the red emergency light turned a blinding, pulsing blue. From the shadows behind me, the heavy thud of tactical boots approached. A voice I hadn't heard in 10 years. A voice I thought was buried in a cemetery in Virginia echoed through the hallway. "Step away from the tablet, Elena. It's time we talked about what really happened to your father." The voice was a jagged glass edge against my memory. Marcus, my father's partner, the man who had supposedly died in a warehouse fire 10 years ago, the same fire that had taken my father's life and reputation. As he stepped into the pulsing blue light, he looked like a ghost made of scars and expensive tailoring. He wasn't just a survivor, he was the architect of the very organized scheme I had been dismantling piece by piece. "Marcus," I whispered, my hand tightening on the tablet, "you didn't just survive, you sold him out. You framed him for the prohibited substances and the illegal weapons to build this shadow empire." Marcus smiled, a thin, humorless line. "Your father was a dreamer, Elena. He thought he could change the world through tech. I knew we could only own it through the organized scheme I've spent a decade perfecting. Julian was a useful idiot, a puppet with a big ego. But you've been a thorn in my side since you took over his logistics." Sienna stepped toward Marcus, handing him the black device. She's tracked every shipment, Marcus. She's linked the radicals we use for transport directly to the Vanguard mainframes. If that tablet uploads, the internal verification team won't just come for Julian. They'll come for the whole network. Julian, realizing he was nothing more than a pawn, slumped against the cold concrete wall. You were using me to get to her? To the data? Shut up, Julian, Sienna snapped, not even looking at him. Marcus leveled a cold gaze at me. Give me the tablet, Elena. For the sake of your father's memory, don't make me add a grave accusation to your file. I can make you disappear. I can make it look like you were the mastermind behind everything. Who do you think the internal security will believe? A disgraced executive or the evidence I've planted in your home? I looked at the tablet, then at the men in tactical gear closing in from both ends of the hallway. I was trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. But Marcus had made one fatal mistake. He thought I was playing the same game he was. He thought I wanted to win. You're right, Marcus, I said, my voice eerily calm. Sentimentality is a liability. Julian taught me that tonight. I tapped a final command on the screen. A countdown began, not for an upload, but for a total system purge. What are you doing? Marcus lunged forward, but I stepped back into the shadow of a heavy steel fire door. I didn't just audit the company, Marcus. I didn't just track the shipments. I turned Vanguard Dynamics into a massive digital internal verification trap. The moment Julian pressed that remote to kill the lights, he triggered a high-priority alert to the real authorities, the ones who have been monitoring this building for the last 3 hours. As if on cue, the ceiling above the ballroom erupted. The sound of heavy rotors thrummed through the building as internal verification teams rappelled from helicopters onto the roof. The blue emergency lights were replaced by the blinding white searchlights of a dozen tactical units. The tablet isn't uploading to a server, I shouted over the rising roar of the sirens. It's a live broadcast to every major news outlet and the internal security headquarters. Every word you just said about the organized scheme, about my father, about the illegal weapons, it's already been seen by millions. Marcus's face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He reached for an unauthorized weapon tucked into his belt, but he was too late. The fire door behind me hissed open as a team of real, internal verification officers flooded the hallway. "Drop it, now," the lead officer barked. Sienna dropped her device immediately, her hands rising in a practiced gesture of surrender. She was a survivor, always looking for the next deal. But Marcus stayed frozen, his eyes locked on mine. He knew he was looking at a huge term in a high-security facility. He knew the empire he had built on my father's ashes was vaporizing in the cold light of the law. Julian was already being zip-tied, sobbing about how he was coerced. He would spend the next several decades facing dozens of years for his part in the organized scheme, his name forever synonymous with betrayal and failure. As the officers moved in to secure Marcus, I stepped past the chaos. I walked back into the ballroom, which was now filled with the harsh, clinical light of the authorities. The guests were being led out, their faces pale with shock. The glamour was gone, replaced by the gritty reality of a crime scene. I stood on the stage where Julian had tried to publicly ruin me just an hour ago. I looked down at the emerald dress, now dusty and torn at the hem. I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't even feel like a hero. I felt like the woman who had finally cleared her father's name. As I walked out of the Grand Pierre ballroom, the cool night air hitting my face, a reporter managed to break through the police line. "Elena, was this all planned? Did you know they were coming for you tonight?" I stopped for a moment, looking at the flashing blue and red lights reflecting in the glass towers of the city we had built. "Julian said tonight was about shedding the old to make room for the new," I said, my voice steady and clear. I just made sure the old finally faced the justice it deserved. I didn't look back as I walked toward the waiting car. Julian had thought he had an ace up his sleeve, but he never realized I was the one who had dealt the deck. The organized scheme was dead, Marcus was in chains, and for the first time in 10 years, the name Vanguard belonged to me alone. The world would remember this night, not for the fall of a power couple, but for the moment the truth finally became the most powerful weapon of all.